Welcome. You've reached a place where history unfolds slowly, one quiet story at a time. So settle into a comfortable position. Dim the lights if you haven't already, and let the distractions of today fade into the background. There's nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do except listen. Together, we'll wander through forgotten civilizations, remarkable journeys, and the everyday lives of people who came long before us. Take a slow, comfortable breath, relax, and let the past gently carry you toward sleep. Tonight, our journey begins on the largest ocean on Earth, a body of water so vast that if you were to lay all of the world's continents inside it, there would still be room left over. We are speaking, of course, of the Pacific, and within this ocean, scattered like handfuls of seed across an impossible distance, lie thousands of islands. Some are large enough to hold entire ecosystems, with mountains and rivers and forests that took shape over millions of years. Others are barely more than a ring of coral rising just above the waves, quiet and small, easy to miss if you did not know exactly where to look. For a very long time, in the story that used to be told about this ocean, these islands were said to have been found mostly by accident. The idea was that people drifted onto them, carried by storms, lost and helpless, arriving on distant shores more by chance than by skill. It was a tidy explanation, and for many years it was the one written into books. But it was not, as we now understand it, the true one. The real story is quieter, and in many ways more remarkable. It is a story of deliberate voyaging, of people who studied the sky every night of their lives until the stars became as familiar and as reliable as the floor beneath their feet. Of sailors who could read the ocean itself, feeling the rhythm of distant swells through the hull of a canoe, sensing the presence of land long before any coastline came into view. It is the story of a navigational tradition so precise, so deeply practiced, that voyagers could set out from one small island and arrive, days or even weeks later, at another small island thousands of kilometers away, without a single instrument that we would recognize today. We call the people who carried out these journeys the Polynesian Wayfinders. And tonight, slowly and without hurry, we will follow their story. We will trace where they came from, how their remarkable double-hulled canoes were built, how the stars were organized into a kind of living compass that circled the sky each night, how the ocean itself became a source of information, and how, generation after generation, this knowledge was carried forward, spoken rather than written, held carefully in memory, and passed from teacher to student across centuries. There is no need to remember every detail tonight. This is not a lesson to be studied. It is simply a story to rest inside of, the way you might rest inside a favorite chair, letting the shape of it hold you as your mind begins to soften and slow. Before we follow the wayfinders themselves, it helps to understand the ocean they lived within. The Pacific covers roughly 1/3 of the surface of the entire planet. It is so wide that it takes up more space than every landmass on Earth combined. And scattered within that enormous expanse, particularly across its central and southern regions, lies a triangular constellation of islands that researchers today refer to as the Polynesian Triangle. If you were to draw a line connecting Hawaii in the north, Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island in the southeast, and Aotearoa, the islands we now call New Zealand, in the southwest, you would trace the rough boundary of this triangle. Within it lie islands such as Tahiti, Samoa, Tonga, the Marquesas, the Cook Islands, and many smaller archipelagos besides. The distances involved are difficult to hold in the mind all at once, so let us take them slowly. From Tahiti to Hawaii is a journey of roughly 4,000 kilometers of open ocean, with no land in between to rest upon, no shoreline to check your position against, nothing but water in every direction for weeks at a time. From Tahiti to Rapa Nui is even farther, a journey across some of the most remote open water on the planet, toward an island so small and so isolated that even by modern satellite measurements, it remains one of the most far-flung inhabited places on Earth. And yet, long before European ships ever entered the Pacific, these journeys had already been made, not once by a single fortunate voyage, but many times by many different crews, following knowledge that had been refined and tested across generations. To understand how this was possible, we have to set aside, for a moment, the modern instruments we usually associate with navigation. There were no compasses. There were no charts drawn on paper, no sextants, no satellite positioning of any kind. And yet the navigators of this tradition did not consider themselves to be navigating blindly. Quite the opposite. They regarded the ocean and the sky as something that could be read, in the same way that a forester learns to read the subtle signs of a forest, or a farmer learns to read the changing color of the soil. The knowledge was not written down in books, because for most of this history, these cultures did not use written script in the way we think of it today. Instead, the knowledge lived in memory. It lived in songs, in chants, in stories passed from a master navigator to an apprentice, sometimes across years of quiet, patient teaching. This is one of the qualities of the wayfinding tradition that researchers have come to find most remarkable. It was not simply a set of technical skills. It was an entire way of perceiving the world, built up slowly through direct experience, and carried forward not through pages, but through people. A navigator did not consult a chart when the sky grew cloudy or the swells grew confusing. He consulted decades of memorized information, held steady in his mind, refined through years of practice at sea, often beginning in childhood. Tonight, we will move through this story gently, tracing its shape the way the wayfinders themselves moved across the ocean. Steadily, patiently, one quiet stretch of water at a time. We will begin with the earliest ancestors of this seafaring tradition, the people who first ventured out from island Southeast Asia many thousands of years ago, carrying with them the seeds of a culture that would eventually stretch across nearly a third of the globe. If you find your eyes growing heavy as we go, there is no need to resist that feeling. You do not need to catch every detail. The ocean we are describing tonight is patient, and so is this story. It will still be here if your mind begins to drift, the way a canoe drifts gently at anchor, rocking softly on a calm sea, going nowhere in particular, simply resting on the surface of the water beneath a wide and quiet sky. Before we continue, if you find that this kind of slow, factual storytelling helps you unwind at the end of the day, you're welcome to subscribe to this channel so that future journeys through history will be there waiting for you the next time you need something calm to listen to as you drift toward sleep. There is no urgency in doing so. It will simply be there quietly whenever you need it. Now let us drift back in time, far earlier than the voyages themselves, to the origins of the people who would one day become the Wayfinders of the Pacific. To understand where the Polynesian Wayfinders came from, we need to travel back roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years to a region of islands and coastlines that today includes Taiwan and the wider area of island Southeast Asia. It was here, according to the evidence gathered by archaeologists and linguists over many decades of careful research, that a broad family of cultures known as the Austronesian peoples began a slow and steady expansion across the water. This was not a single dramatic journey. It was something more gradual, more patient, unfolding across many centuries, one small movement at a time. Communities would settle an island, establish themselves, grow in number, and eventually some among them would set out again, carrying their knowledge, their crops, their animals, and their language toward the next stretch of unfamiliar water. Over time, this slow rhythm of settlement carried Austronesian-speaking peoples an extraordinary distance, eventually reaching as far west as Madagascar off the coast of Africa, and as far east as the most remote islands of the Pacific. The language connections alone tell a remarkable story. Even today, researchers can trace family resemblances between languages spoken in Madagascar, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and across the islands of the Pacific, resemblances that point back to this shared and ancient origin. It is a quiet kind of evidence, but a powerful one, showing just how far this pattern of gradual seafaring settlement was able to travel across thousands of years. Around 3,500 years ago, a particular archaeological culture emerges clearly in the record, one that researchers call the Lapita culture, named after a site in New Caledonia where distinctive pottery bearing this name was first uncovered. The Lapita people are generally understood to be the direct ancestors of the peoples who would later become Polynesian. Their pottery is especially recognizable, decorated with intricate geometric patterns pressed into the wet clay before firing. And fragments of this pottery have been found scattered across a wide arc of islands stretching from the Bismarck archipelago near New Guinea through the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, New Caledonia, and onward to Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. What makes the Lapita expansion especially significant for our story tonight is the speed and confidence with which it unfolded. Within a span of roughly a few hundred years, a very short span of time when measured against the broader arc of human history, Lapita communities settled a chain of islands stretching across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. This was not the slow drift of the earlier Austronesian expansion. It suggests, instead, a group of people who had already begun to develop real skill and confidence in ocean voyaging, capable of striking out toward islands they could not see from their point of departure, trusting in accumulated knowledge of wind, current, and sky. By around 3,000 years ago, Lapita settlers had reached Tonga and Samoa at the western edge of what we now call Polynesia. And here, for reasons that are still debated among researchers, something interesting happened. The outward expansion appears to have paused for a period that may have lasted anywhere from several centuries to as long as 1,000 years, depending on which evidence is weighted most heavily. The communities settled in Tonga, Samoa, and nearby islands seem to have remained largely within this region, developing their own distinct culture, their own language patterns, their own social structures, gradually becoming what we would now recognize as recognizably Polynesian, distinct from the broader Lapita tradition that came before. This long pause is sometimes called the period of ancestral Polynesian society by researchers, and it is thought to be the time during which many of the cultural foundations that would later spread across the wider Pacific were established. The layout of villages, certain religious and social structures, styles of art, and crucially for our story, the navigational knowledge that would eventually carry voyagers across the remaining, far larger distances of open Pacific water, are believed to have been refined during this long, relatively settled period. It is worth pausing here gently to consider what daily life might have looked like during these centuries. These were not people constantly at sea. Between voyages, life would have centered on fishing in lagoons, cultivating crops such as taro and breadfruit and bananas that had been carried carefully from island to island, raising pigs and chickens, and building the kind of stable, rooted community life that any culture depends upon. The voyaging skill for which these people would eventually become famous was built on top of this settled foundation, not in place of it. Sailors who ventured onto the open ocean were drawing on generations of accumulated botanical knowledge, animal husbandry, and social organization that allowed new settlements to succeed once they were reached. Then, around 1,800 years ago, a further expansion began, and this is the phase of history most closely associated with the wayfinders we are focusing on tonight. From the region of Tonga, Samoa, and the nearby islands, voyaging canoes began pushing outward once more, this time across truly enormous distances of open Pacific water, toward island groups that had never before been settled by human beings. The Marquesas, the Society Islands including Tahiti, the Cook Islands, and eventually the farthest corners of the Polynesian Triangle, Hawaii to the north, Rapa Nui to the southeast, and Aotearoa to the southwest, were all reached during this remarkable final phase of expansion. The exact dates for when each of these island groups was first settled remain a subject of ongoing research and gentle scholarly disagreement, with some estimates shifting as new archaeological techniques, particularly more precise radiocarbon dating methods, have been developed and applied to old evidence. But the broad outline is widely agreed upon. Over the span of a few centuries, following that long pause in the Central Pacific, Polynesian voyagers reached and successfully settled nearly every habitable island scattered across this enormous stretch of ocean. A feat of exploration that, when measured against the tools available at the time, remains without a clear parallel anywhere else in human history. What allowed this final, dramatic phase of expansion to succeed was not luck. It was the culmination of a very long tradition of watching, testing, remembering, and teaching. The canoes had been refined across many generations. The knowledge of stars, swells, winds, and birds had been passed down, tested against the ocean itself, corrected when it proved wrong, and carried forward when it proved reliable. In our next segment, we will look closely at the vessels themselves, the double-hulled voyaging canoes that made these journeys physically possible, and the careful craftsmanship that went into building something capable of carrying people, animals, and provisions safely across thousands of kilometers of open water. For now, simply let this settle gently in your mind. A slow migration, unfolding across thousands of years, carried by people who were patient, careful, and endlessly curious about the ocean around them. There is no need to hold on to every date or every name. Let the shape of the story rest with you instead, like the quiet rhythm of waves reaching a shore, over and over, unhurried, arriving exactly when they are meant to. Now that we have traced where the Polynesian voyagers came from, let us turn our attention to the vessels themselves, the double-hulled canoes that carried entire communities safely across thousands of kilometers of open Pacific water. These were not small, fragile craft. A large voyaging canoe of the kind used for major settlement journeys could measure anywhere from 15 to more than 20 meters in length, built from two long hulls set parallel to one another, and joined by a sturdy platform above. This double-hulled design offered something a single-hulled vessel could not easily provide: a wide and stable base that could carry substantial weight, resist tipping in rough seas, and hold a considerable amount of cargo, all while remaining light enough to be paddled or sailed efficiently across long distances. The construction of such a canoe was a slow and deeply respected undertaking, often involving specialists whose knowledge of woodworking had itself been passed down across generations. Large, straight trees were selected carefully, often after a long search through available forest, since a hull needed to be shaped from timber, both strong and light. In many island groups, particular trees were favored for this purpose, and the felling of a large tree intended for a voyaging canoe was frequently accompanied by ceremony, a recognition of the significance of what was being undertaken, and a mark of respect for the material being taken from the land. Shaping the hulls involved carefully hollowing out the trunk, smoothing the interior and exterior surfaces, and gradually forming the long, narrow shape needed to move efficiently through water. Where a single tree was not large enough to form an entire hull, sections would sometimes be joined together, the seams caulked and bound with remarkable care to keep the vessel watertight. The two hulls were then connected by crossbeams, lashed tightly using cordage made from plant fibers, often coconut husk fiber twisted and braided into strong, flexible rope. This lashed construction, rather than the use of metal fastenings, gave the canoe a degree of flexibility that proved valuable in rough seas, allowing the structure to absorb and adjust to the movement of waves, rather than remaining rigidly fixed and prone to cracking under strain. Above the two hulls, a central platform provided space for the crew, for stores of food and fresh water, and often for a small, simple shelter, offering some protection from sun and rain during the long weeks a voyage might require. Sails were typically woven from plant materials such as pandanus leaves, shaped into forms that allowed the canoe to sail not only with a following wind, but also through careful angling, somewhat across the wind, extending the range of directions. A crew could travel without needing to wait for entirely favorable conditions. It is worth pausing to consider what it might have felt like to stand on the deck of such a vessel, out on open water, with no land visible in any direction. The motion would have been steady but ever present, a continuous, gentle rising and falling with the rhythm of the swells passing beneath the hulls. The sound would have been dominated by wind moving across the sail and water moving along the hulls, a consistent, layered sound that experienced sailors learned to interpret almost without conscious thought, noticing immediately when the rhythm changed in some subtle way that might indicate a shift in the wind or an approaching change in the weather. Provisioning a voyage of this kind required careful planning. Crews carried fresh water stored in gourds or bamboo containers, supplemented where possible by rain collected during the journey. Food often included dried and preserved items such as breadfruit paste, dried fish, and coconut in various forms, chosen for qualities that allowed it to remain edible across the weeks a long voyage might take. Live animals, particularly pigs and chickens, and sometimes dogs, were also frequently carried aboard, destined to become the founding populations of these species on whatever new island the voyage was aiming to reach. alongside carefully selected plant cuttings and seeds, including taro, banana, and breadfruit, intended to establish the crops that would sustain a new settlement. This detail matters a great deal for understanding the nature of these voyages. These were not journeys of discovery in the sense of a single explorer setting out simply to see what lay beyond the horizon. They were carefully prepared expeditions intended to found new communities, carrying with them everything believed necessary to establish life successfully on a new and unfamiliar shore. This required not only skilled sailors, but broad cooperation among a wider community, gathering the plants, animals, and provisions needed, often over a period of significant advance planning. The crew of a major voyaging canoe would typically include, alongside the navigator who bore primary responsibility for guiding the vessel, a number of paddlers and sailors responsible for managing the sail and steering, individuals with particular knowledge of the plants and animals being carried, and often entire families intending to settle the new land if the voyage succeeded. Some estimates suggest that voyaging canoes may have carried anywhere from a handful of people up to several dozen, depending on the size of the vessel and the purpose of the specific journey. Steering such a vessel across open water without instruments required not only the navigational knowledge we will explore in the segments ahead, but also considerable physical skill in reading and responding to the canoe's movement through the water. A long steering paddle, held by a dedicated crew member, allowed continuous small adjustments to keep the vessel on its intended course, correcting gently and constantly for the influence of wind and current, much the way a person walking along a windy ridge continuously adjusts their balance without consciously thinking through each individual movement. In recent decades, researchers and cultural practitioners working together have built full-scale replicas of these traditional voyaging canoes, testing them on actual open ocean journeys, following routes believed to mirror those taken by the original wayfinders. These experimental voyages, which we will return to later in our story, have offered valuable confirmation that vessels built using traditional methods and materials were indeed capable of the long, demanding journeys described in oral tradition and inferred from archaeological evidence. The canoes proved seaworthy, stable, and capable of covering the necessary distances within a time frame consistent with the amount of food and water that could realistically be carried aboard. As we move into the next part of our story, we will turn our attention upward to the night sky itself and to the remarkable system of knowledge that allowed a navigator, standing on the deck of a canoe like the one we have just described, to hold a steady course across open water for weeks at a time, guided only by the slow, patient wheel of the stars turning overhead. For now, simply picture the vessel itself, resting quietly on calm water beneath a wide sky, its sail loosely furled, its crew settled for the night, gentle sound of water against the hulls, the only rhythm marking the passage of time. Now we turn to the sky, and to what is often considered the very heart of the wayfinding tradition, a method of navigation that researchers today refer to as the star compass. To understand this system, it helps to first picture the horizon itself as a complete circle surrounding the canoe, stretching a full 360 degrees in every direction. A traditional navigator did not think of this circle in terms of the numbered degrees we might use on a modern compass. Instead, the horizon was divided into a series of named houses or points, each one associated with the place along the horizon where a particular star or a particular group of stars was known to rise or set at certain times of the year. Over the course of a single night and across the different seasons of the year, the stars visible in the sky shift their position in ways that are, in fact, remarkably predictable and consistent, provided you have taken the time to learn their patterns. A star does not rise at a completely random point along the horizon. Each star, depending on its position relative to the Earth's celestial equator, rises and sets at a fairly consistent point along the horizon, night after night, varying only slowly and predictably across the seasons. A master navigator, through years of careful observation, would memorize the rising and setting points of dozens of individual stars and star groupings as the sky rotated slowly overhead across a night. And as one star sank below the horizon while another rose to take its place, the navigator could use this steady procession as a kind of continuously updating reference. In simple terms, the sky itself became the compass, with each star or constellation marking a known bearing, and the navigator's task became one of holding the canoe on a steady course relative to whichever star currently occupied the appropriate position along that mental horizon. This system required not only a prodigious memory, but also a deep, practiced familiarity with the sky that could only be developed across many years, often beginning in early childhood under the guidance of an experienced teacher. Young apprentices might spend countless nights simply watching the sky, learning to recognize not only the position of major stars, but subtle details such as their relative brightness, their color, and the particular shape formed by nearby groupings, until this knowledge became second nature, requiring no conscious calculation, much the way a musician who has practiced for years no longer needs to consciously think through the position of each note. One particularly important reference among many Pacific navigational traditions was the star known in Hawaiian as Hōkūleʻa, corresponding to what is known in Western astronomy as Polaris, or the North Star. Because Polaris sits very close to the celestial pole around which the northern sky appears to rotate, it remains, for observers in the northern hemisphere, almost fixed in position throughout the night, offering a steady, reliable point of reference. However, because much of the Polynesian Triangle lies in the southern hemisphere, or close to the equator where Polaris sits low on the horizon, or is not visible at all, navigators in these regions relied more heavily on other techniques, including tracking the rising and setting points of a whole sequence of stars across the night, rather than depending on any single fixed star. Among the most important of these reference points across many Pacific traditions was the star cluster we know today as the Pleiades, along with other prominent groupings such as the constellation known in the West as Orion, whose distinctive belt of 3 bright stars made it easy to recognize and track the particular stars emphasized, and the specific names given to them varied somewhat between different island cultures across the Pacific, each community developing its own detailed body of knowledge suited to the stars most useful for the routes they most commonly traveled. Navigators also developed techniques for estimating their approximate latitude, the position north or south along the globe. By observing the height of certain stars above the horizon at specific points in their path across the sky, a star that reached its highest point directly overhead at a particular latitude could serve as a marker, so that a navigator observing this same star reaching that same height on a subsequent night could infer that the canoe remained at roughly the same latitude it had held before, even without any way to directly measure this the way a modern instrument might. Of course, the sky is not always cooperative. Clouds gather, storms roll through, and there are many nights across a long voyage when the stars simply cannot be seen at all. It is here that we begin to understand why the wayfinding tradition was never based on the stars alone. A skilled navigator held in memory not only star positions, but an entire integrated body of knowledge, including the direction and character of prevailing winds, the pattern of ocean swells moving beneath the canoe, the behavior of birds, the color and texture of the water, and other subtle signs that together allowed a course to be maintained even through nights when the sky above offered nothing at all. We will spend our next segment together exploring this second half of the wayfinding system, the reading of the ocean itself, in the detail it deserves. For now, let your mind rest on the image of a navigator standing quietly at the stern of a canoe, unhurried, patient, watching the horizon as one star sets gently into the sea and another begins its own slow rise, holding the course steady through nothing more than decades of careful memory and quiet, practiced attention. There is a particular kind of calm in this image, a stillness built not from lack of effort, but from mastery so complete it no longer requires struggle. Perhaps, as you drift now toward sleep, you might borrow a little of that same stillness for yourself. Even on a clear night, a skilled navigator rarely relied on the sky alone. The ocean itself, it turns out, carries an enormous amount of information, provided a person has spent enough years learning to feel it. Let us begin with swells, A swell is different from the choppy, wind-driven waves you might picture when imagining a rough sea. Swells are long, rolling patterns of movement that travel across the ocean's surface, often originating from a distant weather system or a steady prevailing wind, and they can continue traveling for enormous distances, long after the wind that first created them has died away or shifted elsewhere, because a given swell tends to hold a fairly consistent direction as it moves across open water. A navigator who has learned to recognize it can use it much the way a hiker might use a well-worn trail, as a steady, reliable line to orient a course by. What makes this especially remarkable is that swells could often be felt rather than seen, particularly at night, or in conditions where visibility was poor. An experienced navigator could lie down inside the hull of the canoe, feeling the rhythm of its movement through his own body, sensing the particular pattern created by the dominant swell passing beneath the vessel, distinguishing it from smaller, more chaotic wind waves layered on top. Some traditions describe navigators who could identify several distinct swell patterns moving through the water at once, arriving from different distant directions, and use the interaction between them almost like a signature, confirming the canoe's position and heading with a level of subtlety that is difficult for those of us unfamiliar with the practice to fully imagine. Beyond swells, currents also played an important role. Steady ocean currents, flowing consistently in particular directions across broad regions of the Pacific, could push a canoe gradually off its intended course if not accounted for. And experienced navigators learned to anticipate and correct for this drift, much the way a person walking across a strong wind learns to lean slightly into it in order to walk in a straight line, despite the pressure pushing against them. Clouds, too, offered information, particularly when it came to locating land that could not yet be seen. Islands, especially those with any significant elevation, tend to influence the clouds that form above and around them. Warm, moist air rising from a landmass often produces a distinctive stationary cloud, sometimes tinted faintly with color reflecting the lagoon or vegetation below. Hovering above an island, even when the island itself remains well below the horizon, invisible to the eye. A navigator who recognized this kind of cloud, sitting motionless while the surrounding clouds drifted past it with the wind, could adjust course toward it with confidence, often locating an island from a considerable distance before any hint of land itself became visible. Birds provided another valuable and closely studied source of information. Certain seabirds, such as terns and boobies, are known to fly out from their nesting islands each morning to feed at sea, returning again each evening. By observing the direction such birds were flying, particularly in the hours around dawn and dusk, a navigator could infer the likely direction of the nearest island, since the birds were, in effect, commuting between a fixed home and their feeding grounds. Different species of bird could fly out to sea to varying distances before turning back. And navigators who had studied these patterns closely could use the specific type of bird observed, combined with the time of day, to estimate roughly how far away land might be. Floating debris offered further clues as well. Leaves, certain types of seeds, or particular kinds of driftwood, if spotted at sea, could suggest the presence of land somewhere nearby, particularly if the material appeared relatively fresh, rather than having drifted for a long period across open ocean. The color of the water itself could shift subtly in the shallower waters surrounding certain islands or reefs, a change experienced sailors learned to notice even from a considerable distance. All of this information, the stars, the swells, the currents, the clouds, the birds, the debris, was held together in the navigator's mind not as separate, isolated facts, but as a single, integrated picture, continuously updated throughout a voyage. This approach is sometimes described by researchers using the phrase dead reckoning, though the phrase itself comes from Western navigational tradition and can understate just how rich and multidimensional the Polynesian version of this practice truly was. Rather than plotting precise coordinates on a chart, a navigator maintained an ongoing mental sense of the canoe's position, continuously adjusted based on estimated speed, elapsed time, the heading held relative to swells and stars, and any additional signs, such as birds or clouds, encountered along the way. This was demanding, sustained mental work, carried out often with very little sleep across a voyage that might last many days or weeks. Some accounts describe navigators resting only in brief periods, remaining continuously aware of the canoe's motion, even while appearing to doze. So attuned to the rhythm of the swells that any subtle change would immediately draw their attention, waking them from even a light rest. It is worth sitting with this image for a moment. A person deeply skilled, deeply practiced, resting lightly while still remaining gently aware of the world moving around them, trusting a body of knowledge built up over years to hold steady, even while consciousness itself softens toward sleep. There may be something familiar in that image, something not so different from what your own body and mind are doing right now, drifting gradually toward rest, while some quiet, steady part of you continues here, listening, unhurried, exactly as it should. In our next segment, we will look at how this entire body of knowledge, the stars, the swells, the birds, and everything else we have discussed, was passed from one generation of navigators to the next, through years of dedicated teaching and practice, long before any of it was ever written down. The extraordinary body of knowledge we have been describing, covering the stars, the ocean swells, the winds, the birds, and so much else, was never written down in the societies that first developed it. Instead, it lived entirely within human memory, carried forward through direct teaching, generation after generation, in a tradition that researchers today often refer to as an oral tradition of navigation. Training to become a navigator typically began in early childhood, often within families where this knowledge had already been held for many generations. A young apprentice might begin simply by spending time near the water, learning to recognize different fish, different currents in a familiar lagoon, and the ordinary rhythms of tide and weather close to home. Long before ever being trusted with responsibility on an open ocean voyage, over time, under the patient guidance of an experienced teacher, often an older relative or a respected community elder, the apprentice would be introduced gradually to more complex knowledge, learning to recognize individual stars, to understand their rising and setting points, and eventually to hold in memory the full star compass we described earlier. Much of this teaching relied on repetition, chant, and structured memory techniques, designed to make an enormous body of information easier to retain and recall reliably, even under the pressure and fatigue of a real voyage. Some traditions describe the use of physical models to aid this learning, such as arrangements of stones laid out on the ground, representing the position of stars along the horizon, allowing a student to walk through the star compass physically before ever needing to apply it while standing on the deck of a moving canoe at sea. Songs and chants also played an important role, encoding sailing directions, star names, and other crucial details in a form that was easier to memorize accurately and pass along without error than plain spoken instruction might have been. Trust and reputation mattered enormously within this tradition. A master navigator carried significant social status within their community, and the responsibility placed upon them was considerable, since the survival of an entire voyaging party, and often the success of establishing a new settlement, depended directly on their skill and judgment. Becoming recognized as a master navigator was not a matter of a single test or certificate, but rather the gradual accumulation of trust built across years of demonstrated competence, often beginning with shorter, lower-risk voyages between islands that were already familiar, before eventually being entrusted with longer and more uncertain journeys into unknown waters. It is worth pausing to consider just how much sustained patience this entire system required, both from the teacher and from the student. Mastery of this kind was never rushed. It could not be compressed into a short course of study. It unfolded slowly across years, sometimes across an entire childhood and into early adulthood, built through countless quiet nights spent watching the sky, countless hours spent on the water learning to feel the subtle differences between one swell pattern and another. There is something worth sitting within that pace, in a tradition that trusted slow, steady accumulation of understanding over any kind of shortcut, valuing depth of knowledge built patiently over time rather than speed of acquisition. As Polynesian voyaging expanded outward across the wider Pacific, reaching increasingly distant island groups. This knowledge, naturally, had to be adapted to new circumstances. A navigator raised with detailed knowledge of the skies and swells surrounding one particular region might need, upon settling or traveling toward a very different part of the ocean, to adjust that knowledge to account for different visible stars, different prevailing wind patterns, and different swell directions suited to the new geography. This adaptability, the ability to apply a deeply learned underlying framework to genuinely new and unfamiliar circumstances, speaks to just how robust and flexible this system of knowledge truly was, rather than being a rigid set of memorized facts tied to only one specific place. Over the centuries following the Great Expansion across the Polynesian Triangle, as islands became more settled and long-distance voyaging between the most far-flung island groups became somewhat less frequent, some of this navigational knowledge gradually receded from everyday use in many parts of the Pacific, though it never entirely disappeared. In certain places, particularly on some of the smaller and more remote islands of Micronesia, including the island of Samoa, the tradition of deep-sea, instrument-free navigation continued to be actively practiced and taught, generation after generation, largely without interruption, even as it grew rarer elsewhere across the wider ocean. This continuity would eventually prove enormously significant, for reasons we will explore later in our story, when a renewed interest in traditional Polynesian voyaging emerged in the 20th century, and researchers and cultural practitioners turned to these remaining unbroken traditions in search of knowledge that could help revive practices that had, in many other island groups, been quietly fading from active use. For now, let us simply rest in the image of teaching passed gently from one generation to the next, an older voice speaking quietly beside a younger one, pointing toward the sky, describing patterns that had themselves been described the same way for hundreds of years before. There is a particular comfort in traditions built this way, unhurried, patient, trusting that knowledge shared slowly and carefully will hold its shape far better than knowledge rushed. Perhaps you might let that same unhurried quality settle over you now, as your own evening winds gently toward its close. Let us return now to the geography of the voyages themselves, moving steadily through the islands that were settled across this long history, beginning with the Western Pacific, where the Lapita voyagers we spoke of earlier first established the communities that would eventually become recognizably Polynesian. Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa sit close together in the southwestern Pacific, and archaeological evidence suggests that Lapita settlers reached this general region roughly 3,000 years ago, arriving after the earlier, longer expansion that carried their ancestors gradually eastward from the Bismarck Archipelago near New Guinea. These islands offered fertile volcanic soil, reliable rainfall, and generally favorable conditions for the crops these voyagers carried with them, including taro, yams, and breadfruit, allowing settled agricultural communities to establish themselves and grow steadily over the generations that followed. Tonga, in particular, developed into an important and influential center within the wider region. Over the centuries, a complex political structure emerged there, eventually including a system of chiefship, whose influence, according to oral tradition and some archaeological evidence, extended at various points to neighboring island groups as well. The large stone structures found on Tongatapu, the main island of Tonga, including a distinctive trilithon known as the Hamonga a Maui, thought by some researchers to have possible astronomical significance related to the changing seasons, speak to the sophistication and organizational capacity these communities were able to develop over time. Samoa, lying not far from Tonga, developed its own distinct social and cultural traditions during this same period, including the foundations of what is known today as the Fa Samoa, or the Samoan Way, a set of social customs, values, and structures that continue to shape Samoan society into the present day. The close relationship between Tonga and Samoa across these centuries, including periods of exchange, alliance, and at times rivalry, forms an important part of the broader story of how Polynesian culture developed and diversified as it settled into this western region. It was from this general area, Tonga, Samoa, and the surrounding islands, that researchers believe the further eastward expansion of Polynesian voyaging eventually began. Following that long period of relative settlement we discussed earlier, sometimes called ancestral Polynesian society, voyagers pushing east from this region would have needed to cross significant stretches of open water to reach the next major island groups, including the Cook Islands, the Society Islands, and the Marquesas, all considerably farther from the familiar waters around Tonga and Samoa than any of the shorter hops that had characterized the earlier Lapita expansion. This eastward push represented, in many ways, the true beginning of the long-distance, deep ocean voyaging tradition for which Polynesian wayfinders are best known today. The distances involved increased substantially compared to the earlier stages of settlement, and the navigational knowledge required to reliably make these crossings, and just as importantly, to return home again along a known route to fetch additional settlers or supplies, needed to be considerably more developed and precise than what earlier, shorter voyages had demanded. It's worth taking a moment to imagine what it must have felt like to be among the communities preparing for these journeys during this era. Unlike the earliest Lapita voyagers moving through a chain of islands that were, relatively speaking, not too distant from one another, these later voyagers were setting out toward stretches of ocean where the nearest known land might be many hundreds of kilometers away. well beyond what could be reached in a single day's travel, requiring voyages that would need to sustain a crew across many days or weeks at sea, entirely dependent on the navigational and provisioning knowledge we explored in earlier segments. The success of these voyages, again and again, across many separate expeditions and multiple different island groups eventually settled, speaks to just how reliable this navigational tradition had become by this point in its development. This was not a matter of one fortunate journey. It was a sustained, repeated pattern of successful long-distance voyaging, carried out by many different crews across a period of a few centuries, gradually filling in what had previously been empty stretches of ocean on the human map of the Pacific. In our next segment, we will follow these voyagers further east, toward the Society Islands, the Marquesas, and the Cook Islands, tracing how these central Pacific archipelagos came to be settled, and how they would later serve, in turn, as the launching points for the final, most distant stretch of the Polynesian expansion, toward Hawaii, Rapa Nui, and Aotearoa. For now, let your thoughts rest gently on the image of these western Pacific islands, as they might have looked in those early centuries, green and quiet beneath a wide sky. Canoes drawn up along calm lagoon shores, communities settling into the steady, patient rhythms of island life, unaware that the knowledge they were quietly developing would one day carry their descendants across nearly the entire width of the largest ocean on Earth. Moving steadily eastward from Tonga and Samoa, Polynesian voyagers eventually reached the island groups of the Central Pacific, including the Marquesas Islands, the Society Islands, home to Tahiti, and the Cook Islands. Current archaeological evidence, though still subject to ongoing refinement, suggests these islands were settled sometime within the broad window of roughly 1,000 to 1,500 years ago. Though, as we've noted, precise dating across this period continues to be actively researched and occasionally revised as new methods are applied to existing evidence. The Marquesas Islands, remote and mountainous, rising dramatically from deep ocean waters, with relatively little surrounding reef compared to some other Pacific island groups, developed a distinct and vibrant culture following their settlement. Marquesan art, particularly elaborate wood carving and tattooing traditions, became especially well developed. And some researchers have proposed the Marquesas as an important secondary launching point for further voyages of exploration and settlement deeper into the Pacific, including potentially toward Hawaii. Though this specific role remains a subject of continued scholarly discussion, Tahiti and the surrounding Society Islands developed into what many researchers describe as an especially significant cultural and religious center within the wider Polynesian world during this period. The Mari, sacred ceremonial sites built from carefully arranged stone platforms found throughout the Society Islands, speak to the religious and social importance these islands held. Tahiti, in particular, would go on to play a central role in the later stages of Polynesian voyaging, with oral traditions from Hawaii, Aotearoa, and other distant island groups frequently referencing Tahiti, sometimes under related names such as Kahiki, as an ancestral homeland from which their own founding voyagers set sail. The Cook Islands, scattered across a wide stretch of ocean between Tahiti and Samoa, were also settled during this general period, developing their own distinct communities across islands ranging from the larger, more fertile Rarotonga to smaller, more remote atolls elsewhere in the group. Their position, roughly midway between the Western and Central Pacific Island groups, meant the Cook Islands likely played an important role as a waypoint within the wider network of voyaging routes, connecting different parts of the Polynesian world during this era. It's worth pausing here to consider just how connected, rather than isolated, these Central Pacific communities appear to have remained during this period, at least based on the evidence available to researchers today, rather than picturing each island group developing in complete separation from the others. Evidence, including shared artistic styles, similar tool-making traditions, and closely related, though gradually diverging languages, suggests these communities remained in at least periodic contact with one another across considerable distances, continuing to voyage back and forth even after the initial settlement of a given island had been completed. This ongoing voyaging, connecting settled islands to one another, rather than only representing outward, one-directional expansion into new territory, speaks to just how thoroughly the navigational skills we discussed earlier had become embedded within the broader culture of this era, treated not as a rare, specialized skill reserved only for the most dramatic exploratory journeys, but as a regularly exercised, sustained capability supporting ongoing connection and exchange across the wider Polynesian world. It was from this Central Pacific region, and Tahiti and the Society Islands in particular, according to much of the oral tradition preserved in Hawaii and elsewhere, that the final and most demanding stage of Polynesian voyaging is generally believed to have originated. From here, voyagers pushed outward toward the farthest, most remote corners of the Polynesian Triangle, journeys that would require holding a steady course across open ocean for distances considerably greater than anything attempted before, toward destinations so far away and so small relative to the vastness of open water surrounding them that finding them at all stands as one of the most remarkable achievements in the entire history of human exploration. In our next segment, we will follow these final voyages toward Hawaii in the far north, toward Rapa Nui in the remote southeast, and toward Aotearoa in the temperate south, tracing the last and most extraordinary stretch of this long Pacific story. For now, let us simply rest in the image of Tahiti and its neighboring islands as an important center of this ancient world. Canoes arriving and departing along quiet lagoon shores, carrying not only people and provisions, but stories, songs, and knowledge passed between islands separated by hundreds of kilometers of open water, held together across that distance by nothing more than memory, skill, and careful attention to the sky and sea. We come now to the final and most distant stage of this long Pacific story, the settlement of the 3 points that mark the corners of the Polynesian Triangle: Hawaii to the north, Rapa Nui to the southeast, and Aotearoa, the islands we know today as New Zealand, to the south. Hawaii lies roughly 4,000 kilometers north of Tahiti and the Society Islands, across open ocean with no significant landmasses in between to offer any point of reference along the way. According to current archaeological evidence, voyagers reached and began settling the Hawaiian Islands sometime within the broad range of roughly 800 to 1,000 years ago. Though, as with other dates in this story, ongoing research continues to refine this estimate. Hawaiian oral tradition preserves detailed genealogies and chants describing voyages back and forth between Hawaii and Tahiti across subsequent generations, referring to this distant southern homeland as Kahiki, suggesting that even after the initial settlement voyage, some degree of continued contact and travel between these two very distant island groups may have persisted for a period of time. The Hawaiian Islands themselves, formed by volcanic activity and rising in places to considerable height, including Mauna Kea, which measured from its base on the ocean floor is taller than any other mountain on Earth, offered rich and varied environments for the settlers who arrived there, ranging from lush windward valleys to drier leeward coasts, allowing Hawaiian culture to develop its own distinct traditions, including a complex system of land management known as the Ahupua, which organized each parcel of land as a strip running from mountain to sea, ensuring access to the full range of resources needed to sustain a community. Rapa Nui, known to its own people as Rapa Nui, and to much of the wider world by the name Easter Island, given by later European visitors, represents perhaps the most remote inhabited point in the entire Pacific, lying an extraordinary distance from any other significant landmass. Current evidence suggests the island was settled sometime within a range that researchers continue to debate, with some estimates placing initial settlement around 800 years ago, though this remains an area of genuine ongoing scholarly discussion, with some studies proposing dates somewhat earlier or later based on differing analyses of the same limited evidence. Given the island's extreme isolation, the voyage required to reach it stands as one of the most demanding navigational feats attributed to this entire tradition. Crossing vast stretches of open ocean toward a destination so small and so remote that locating it at all, without any of the navigational knowledge we discussed earlier, would be virtually impossible. The society that developed on Rapa Nui following its settlement is, of course, well known for the remarkable moai, the large stone figures carved from volcanic rock found across the island, believed to represent important ancestors and to have held deep religious and social significance for the community that carved them. The isolation of Rapa Nui, so extreme compared to most other Polynesian islands, meant that once settled, this community developed largely independently across subsequent centuries, with limited ongoing contact with the wider Polynesian world. A genuinely unique case within the broader story we have been following tonight. Aotearoa, the final major point of this long expansion, lies considerably farther south than most other Polynesian islands, well outside the tropical zone that characterizes much of the Pacific, and offering a noticeably different climate and environment upon arrival. Current evidence suggests these islands were settled somewhat later than Hawaii and Rapa Nui, with much of the archaeological evidence pointing toward a settlement period sometime around 700 to 800 years ago, making Aotearoa likely among the last major landmasses on Earth to be reached and settled by human beings. The voyagers who reached Aotearoa encountered a landscape strikingly different from the smaller tropical islands most of Polynesia consisted of, including a considerably larger landmass, colder temperatures, particularly in the south, and an environment that required real adaptation in terms of agriculture, clothing, and shelter. Maori culture, which developed among the descendants of these voyagers, incorporated and adapted many elements of the broader Polynesian tradition we have followed throughout this story, while also developing distinct innovations suited to this new and different environment, including particular approaches to woodworking, weaving, and eventually a rich oral tradition of its own, including detailed accounts of the founding voyaging canoes and the navigators who guided them, many of which remain an important part of Maori identity and history today. Taken together, the settlement of Hawaii, Rapa Nui, and Aotearoa marks the completion of what stands as one of the most extraordinary feats of exploration and migration in all of human history, achieved not through any single dramatic voyage, but through centuries of accumulated knowledge, careful preparation, and repeated, patient, successful crossings of some of the most open and demanding ocean water anywhere on Earth. By the time this expansion drew to a close, Polynesian voyagers and their descendants had come to occupy nearly every habitable island scattered across an area of ocean covering roughly 10 million square miles, a scale of successful settlement that remains, even now, difficult to fully compare to any other chapter of human history. In our next segment, we will turn to what happened after this great age of expansion drew to its natural close, exploring how island communities settled into the more localized rhythms of daily life across the centuries that followed, and how, much later, this remarkable navigational tradition would come to be remembered, studied, and ultimately revived. For now, simply hold this picture gently in your mind. An ocean once entirely empty of human presence, gradually, patiently, filled with quiet island communities scattered from the cold southern shores of Aotearoa to the volcanic peaks of Hawaii, connected across that immense distance not by any written record, but by a shared body of knowledge, carried carefully, generation after generation, across the wide and patient sea. For several centuries, following the great age of Polynesian expansion, we have been tracing tonight. Long distance, voyaging between the most far-flung corners of the Polynesian Triangle, appears to have gradually become less frequent across much of the Pacific. Island communities, now well established, generally settled into more localized patterns of life, with voyaging often continuing on a smaller scale between nearby islands, while the especially demanding, specialized knowledge required for the longest open ocean crossings became, in many places, less actively practiced and passed down. By the time European ships began arriving in the Pacific in significant numbers, beginning in the 16th century and continuing over the centuries that followed, many of these visitors were, in fact, genuinely puzzled by what they encountered. They found small, isolated islands, separated from one another by enormous stretches of open ocean, already inhabited by closely related peoples, speaking related languages and sharing related customs. And many of these early European observers found it difficult to imagine how such distant settlement could possibly have been achieved without the kind of instruments and charts their own seafaring tradition depended upon. This puzzlement, over time, contributed to the theory we mentioned back in our first segment tonight, the idea that Pacific islands might have been settled largely by accident, through people drifting helplessly on ocean currents, rather than through deliberate, skilled voyaging. This view persisted in much Western scholarship for a very long time, well into the 20th century, even as it stood in direct contradiction to the rich oral traditions maintained by Pacific Island communities themselves, traditions that consistently described purposeful, planned voyages guided by skilled and respected navigators. It was only gradually, through the careful work of researchers willing to take these oral traditions seriously, alongside advancing archaeological and linguistic evidence, that this older, dismissive view began to be reconsidered. A particularly significant turning point came in the 1970s, connected to a remarkable navigator named Piailug, born on the small island of Samoa in what is now the Federated States of Micronesia. Piailug had been trained from early childhood in the traditional navigational methods we described earlier in our story, part of an unbroken teaching lineage that had continued on Samoa, even as similar knowledge had grown rarer across much of the wider Pacific. In 1976, Piailug agreed to serve as navigator for a newly built traditional voyaging canoe named Hōkūleʻa, constructed in Hawaii as part of a growing effort among Hawaiian and Pacific researchers and cultural practitioners to determine, through direct practical demonstration, whether traditional wayfinding methods could genuinely guide a vessel successfully across the open ocean between Hawaii and Tahiti, following a route believed to mirror the ancient voyages we have followed tonight. Piailug navigated the entire voyage using only traditional methods, without any modern instruments, reading the stars, the swells, and the other signs we discussed earlier across weeks of open ocean sailing. The canoe reached Tahiti successfully, and its arrival was met by a large and deeply moved crowd gathered along the shore, a moment that is often described as a profoundly significant one, not only for confirming what many Pacific communities had always known through their own oral traditions, but for sparking a renewed sense of pride and interest in traditional voyaging and navigational knowledge across Hawaii and the wider Pacific. In the years that followed, Piailug went on to teach these traditional methods to a new generation of Hawaiian navigators, including Nainoa Thompson, who would go on to become an accomplished navigator in his own right, and a significant figure in the continued growth of this revival movement. Hōkūleʻa itself continued sailing across subsequent decades, eventually completing numerous long-distance voyages throughout the Pacific, and in more recent years, circumnavigating the entire globe, carrying with it, wherever it traveled, the story of traditional Polynesian navigation and the patient, careful body of knowledge that made it possible. This revival has extended well beyond a single canoe or a single voyage. Across the wider Pacific today, a growing number of navigators, many trained in methods tracing directly back to teachers such as Piailug, continue to practice and teach traditional wayfinding, ensuring that this remarkable body of knowledge, once at genuine risk of being lost in many regions, continues to be passed forward to new generations, much as it was passed down, quietly and patiently, across the many centuries we have followed together tonight. As we bring our journey to its close this evening, it is worth sitting for a moment with the full shape of the story we have traced, beginning many thousands of years ago among the islands of Southeast Asia, carried steadily eastward across the Lapita expansion, settling for a long, quiet period in Tonga and Samoa, before pushing outward once more toward Tahiti, the Marquesas, and the Cook Islands, and finally reaching the farthest, most remote corners of the Pacific in Hawaii, Rapa Nui, and Aotearoa. At every stage of this immense journey, the thread that held it together was not luck, and not chance, but a deep, patiently developed understanding of the stars overhead and the ocean below, carried forward faithfully from one generation to the next, through nothing more than memory, careful teaching, and quiet, sustained attention. There is something worth carrying with you from this story as you drift now toward your own rest tonight. The wayfinders we have followed together were not in any hurry. Their knowledge was built slowly, tested patiently, and trusted precisely because it had been developed with such care over such a long span of time. Perhaps, as your own evening draws to its close, there is something useful in that same unhurried patience, a reminder that rest, like a long ocean voyage, does not need to be rushed to reach where it is going. Thank you for spending this quiet time with us tonight, following the long, patient story of the Polynesian Wayfinders across the width of the largest ocean on Earth. If stories like this one help ease you toward sleep, you're welcome to subscribe so that future journeys through history will be here waiting whenever you need them again. For now, let the sound of this voice fade gently into silence, and let sleep, like a canoe reaching a quiet harbor after a long voyage, arrive exactly when it is ready to. Good night.